The estate stood in silence, its grand walls crumbling, its windows hollow like the sockets of a skull staring into eternity. What had once been the pride of a family, the sprawling mansion built with wealth that seemed untouchable, was now nothing more than a carcass of stone and timber, left to rot beneath the slow gnawing of time. The gardens, once perfumed with roses and meticulously shaped hedges, had grown wild, choking the marble pathways with weeds that clawed upward as though desperate to drag the estate into the earth itself. Ivy draped itself over balconies where ladies in silk once laughed, and owls nested where chandeliers once glittered with light. There was a heaviness about the place, an atmosphere thick with whispers no wind could carry away. Strangers who passed on the road below would lower their voices and hurry along, unwilling to draw the notice of whatever lingered there. Children dared each other to creep closer, only to bolt at the first rustle of the overgrown hedges. The house had gained a reputation darker than simple decay. It was said that the wealth of that family had not disappeared with time, but with something older, hungrier, and less forgiving. Inside the husk of the great hall, dust veiled the remnants of grandeur. A long dining table, warped by damp, still stretched across the room, its surface scarred by the weight of countless feasts. Portraits of ancestors hung crooked on the walls, their painted eyes clouded by mildew, their faces fading into obscurity. In the silence, one might almost hear echoes of arguments that once rang beneath that roof. Sons bickering over their shares, the father's voice booming with authority, the daughter's pleas drowned out by the laughter of men who believed themselves eternal. Yet nothing lasts forever, not stone, not gold, not even blood ties. They said the family had been wealthy beyond measure, hoarding treasures in vaults dug deep beneath the earth. Coins of gold, jewelry of rarest gems, heirlooms meant to survive centuries. But one by one, the vaults emptied not into eager hands but into nothingness. Gold that glittered at dusk crumbled into gray dust by dawn. Jewels turned brittle, cracking like glass, until all that was left was ash, slipping through the fingers of those who once clutched it with greed. The villagers whispered of betrayal, of a daughter denied her rightful place, cast into the shadows while her brothers bathed in light. They whispered of a curse that rose not from witchcraft but from the weight of injustice, a curse that demanded balance. No matter how the story was told, it ended the same way, with ruin, with madness, with riches turning to ash. The house seemed to ask its own question to those who dared to gaze at its hollow face. What is wealth when it brings only ruin? What is inheritance if it carries only sorrow? And most of all, what is gold worth if it rots in your hand? The man who built the estate had not been born into privilege. His beginnings were humble, carved out of hardship and the sweat of his own brow. As a young boy, he had known hunger intimately, had lain awake at night in a one-room cottage where the rain seeped through the roof and pooled at his feet. He had vowed even then that poverty would never again sit at his table. That vow became the fire that drove him, and with each passing year, he clawed his way upward. He bartered, he built, he seized every chance others were too timid to grasp. By the time he reached his middle years, he was known throughout the province as a man whose fortune grew like wildfire, ruthless, cunning, and unyielding. His estate rose like a monument to that vow. Set upon a hill that overlooked the valley, the mansion gleamed with imported stone and tall windows that reflected the sun like mirrors. Visitors who stepped inside were met with polished marble floors, towering staircases, and ceilings painted with murals of angels and conquerors alike. Every surface was touched with opulence. Gold-framed mirrors, carved furniture from foreign lands, velvet curtains so heavy that even the air seemed to bow beneath them. But beneath the grand show of the halls lay what the man valued most, the vaults. Buried beneath the earth, hidden behind iron doors and locks thicker than a man's arm, the vaults held his heart's true pride. Piles of coins, gleaming in torchlight, stacked in heaps that reached the ceiling. Jewels and ornaments, rubies like drops of blood, emeralds that caught fire in the light, diamonds that seemed carved from ice. There were heirlooms of forgotten dynasties, relics of kings, treasures bought and treasures stolen, all gathered into his possession. To him, gold was not merely wealth, it was proof of his victory over the poverty that had once bound him. Each coin was a reminder that he had risen above all others, and that no one, not even death, could diminish what he had built. But though his vaults were filled, his household was divided. He had sons, and from the moment they were born, they were draped in the certainty that they would inherit his kingdom of stone and gold. They were taught to carry his name, to mirror his ambition, to believe that the estate and its riches were theirs by divine right. Every triumph of theirs, no matter how small, was celebrated. Every flaw was excused, every cruelty overlooked. They grew arrogant, assured that the world would bend before them as it had bent before their father. And then there was the daughter. She was clever, sharp-eyed, and quick of wit, but her gifts were shadows to him, eclipsed by the brilliance he believed his sons carried. In a house where tradition dictated that sons carried the family name and daughters were little more than bargaining tools for alliances, she was tolerated but never truly seen. She dined at the same table but was not part of the same future. Her voice in family councils was silenced before it had even risen. When she sought to prove herself, managing household affairs, advising with uncanny wisdom, her efforts were dismissed as meddling. Yet she watched, she learned, she remembered. Unlike her brothers, who saw the estate only as a prize to be won, she saw the cracks in its foundation. She understood the cost of her father's relentless hunger, the enemies he made, the bitterness that festered in his pursuit of gold. She alone grasped that a fortune built upon greed could not stand unchallenged forever. The father's will was spoken of long before it was written. He boasted of it to his guests, to his advisors, to his sons themselves. The estate would be divided among them, each son taking a portion of the gold, the lands, the treasures, so that his bloodline would endure in splendor. And as for his daughter, well, she would be taken care of. A polite phrase, thin as smoke, that meant she would receive little more than enough to keep her from shame. Not because she lacked worth, but because tradition had declared her unworthy. It was in that belief, in that blind adherence to old ways, that the seeds of ruin were sown. For the man who had built his life on conquering poverty and fate could not conquer the truth that had stalked him since boyhood. Greed is a fire that consumes not only what it touches but those who cling too tightly to its warmth. And in the vaults beneath his estate, though the gold shone brighter than the sun, the shadows had already begun to stir. She had come into the world beneath the same roof as her brothers, breathing the same air, hearing the same lullabies whispered by tired servants in the hush of night. Yet from the moment of her birth, her path had been different, shaped not by her own doing but by the weight of tradition. A daughter was expected to be gentle, obedient, and eventually given away like a parcel of goods in exchange for alliances or advantage. She understood this as all daughters did, but within her there stirred a mind too sharp to be dulled and a spirit too restless to be caged. From childhood, she absorbed everything around her, the way her father conducted business, the expressions of men at the negotiating table, the careful lies woven into polite conversation. While her brothers mocked her curiosity, she listened. While they wasted their lessons on play, she mastered her letters, her numbers, her understanding of accounts and ledgers. It was she, not they, who could calculate profits faster than a steward, or recall the names and debts of merchants who came calling. But such talents, when housed in a daughter, were treated not as gifts but as curiosities. Her father would laugh when she corrected an error in his records, patting her head as though she were a precocious child rather than a mind equal to his own. Yet, despite the dismissal, there were moments of closeness between them, quiet threads of affection woven through an otherwise cold tapestry. When she was younger, she would sit by his chair as he worked late into the night, her small voice breaking the silence with questions about the world. To his surprise, she listened intently, never losing interest. Sometimes, when his sternness softened, he would tell her stories of his youth, of how he had fought against poverty, how he had sworn never to let his children know hunger. She would cling to those tales, imagining herself part of that struggle, imagining that she too was destined to inherit his strength. On rare evenings, he would let her run her fingers over a golden coin or trace the patterns of a jeweled brooch, saying, "This, all of this, is the proof that I conquered fate. One day you will understand." It was in those moments that she believed, truly believed, she was not invisible. That belief, fragile though it was, made the years of neglect harder to bear. For as she grew, she began to see the gulf widen. Her brothers were invited to councils, their opinions sought even when childish and ill-formed. They were praised for victories they had not earned, rewarded for ambitions that were fed to them on silver spoons. She, meanwhile, was told to tend to the household, to occupy herself with embroidery or music, as though her mind could be quieted with a needle and thread. When she offered advice, her words were brushed aside. When she questioned decisions, her voice was drowned in laughter. Still she endured. Endurance was her armor. She swallowed the bitterness and smiled when required, biding her time, hoping that the bond she had once shared with her father would blossom into recognition. She worked quietly in the background, ensuring that the estate ran smoothly when her brother's arrogance threatened to unravel it. Servants came to her with problems they dared not bring to the masters, and she solved them with a calmness that belied her years. Even as she was denied acknowledgement, the household moved according to her unseen hand. It was during one such moment of quiet duty that her father had spoken words she never forgot. She had found him one evening alone in the study, wearied by age and the weight of his wealth. He had looked at her, not past her, not through her, but at her, and said, "You are the only one who understands what all this truly means. Your brothers hunger for the gold, but they do not see the fire it takes to guard it. You see it. You feel it. One day you will have your share, though others may not know it now." Those words were a flame in her heart, a promise etched into her soul. They carried her through years of being overlooked, through the sting of being excluded, through the endless rituals that reminded her of her lesser place. She clung to the certainty that when the time came, when the will was read and the estate divided, her father would not forget her. He would honor the bond they shared, the promise he had whispered in the quiet of that study. But as seasons passed and her father's health declined, she began to sense the shadows of betrayal creeping in. Conversations hushed when she entered the room. Papers were signed in secrecy. Her brothers grew bolder, speaking of their inheritance as though it were already theirs, never once mentioning her. She searched her father's face for reassurance, but his eyes, once sharp with certainty, grew clouded with age and weariness. Still she held on. She told herself that promises made in confidence carried more weight than traditions shouted in public. She reminded herself that he had once seen her clearly, and that memory would guide his hand when the time came. Yet in the silence of her chamber, as the candles burned low and shadows stretched long across the walls, doubt whispered to her. Doubt told her that promises, like gold, could crumble into dust when grasped too tightly. Doubt told her that love, when tested against tradition, often lost. And so she endured, loyal and unseen, intelligent and disregarded, bearing the burden of invisibility with dignity. But beneath that quiet endurance lay a wound that never healed, a wound cut not by enemies, but by the hand of the man she had loved most, the hand that had once promised her a place in a legacy that was already slipping from her grasp. The father's decline came slowly, like a long shadow creeping across the land. At first, it was a cough that clung to him through the winter, shrugged off with the stubborn pride of a man who had never allowed weakness to mark his body. But as the seasons turned, the cough deepened, and the man who once strode through his halls like a conqueror began to falter. His voice, once booming with authority, softened to a hoarse rasp. His steps grew unsteady, the marble floors of his estate no longer echoing with the confident rhythm that had once intimidated friend and foe alike. Servants whispered of his failing strength, of nights when he remained awake, pacing and coughing until dawn. Rumors spread beyond the walls, that the mighty man who had amassed more gold than kings was now being robbed of his breath by something no vault could bar. The villagers spoke of it as retribution, a sign that the spirits themselves had grown weary of his greed. Within the estate, his sons pretended not to see the frailty overtaking him, already turning their eyes toward the horizon of inheritance. The daughter, however, saw it clearly. She tended him when others would not, bringing him water when the coughing fits left him breathless, sitting quietly by his bed when the nights seemed endless. In those dim-lit hours, when pain loosened his tongue, he would look at her with eyes clouded not only by illness but by regret. Once, as she dabbed a cloth across his forehead, he murmured, "You are the one who understands." The words echoed those he had spoken in the study years before, a thread of hope she clutched tightly. She believed even then that though tradition might favor the sons, her father would not forget her. Whispers spread through the servants' quarters that the master had made promises in secret. Some claimed he had told his daughter she would not be left with nothing. Others said he had prepared a hidden document, one that would alter the course of inheritance. The rumors swirled like smoke, feeding her fragile hope, even as her brothers dismissed the idea with cruel laughter. "A daughter's place is not in the vault," they sneered. "She will be cared for, nothing more." But deep within her heart, she believed otherwise. The illness dragged him down into weakness, and at last death claimed him in the stillness of a winter morning. The estate mourned, or at least appeared to. The halls were draped in black, candles flickered in endless rows, and the family accepted condolences from distant kin and curious onlookers. But beneath the veil of grief lay an impatient hunger. The sons were restless, eager for the day when the sealed will would be opened and their futures laid bare in ink and signature. The reading was held in the great hall, the air thick with anticipation. The family gathered, the daughter seated apart, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The lawyer, a thin man with spectacles that glinted in the dim light, unfurled the parchment and began to read. Each word seemed to hang in the air like a tolling bell. He spoke of gratitude, of legacy, of wealth earned through toil and determination. And then came the division. the estate, the lands, the vaults of gold, all bequeathed to the sons. Every coin, every jewel, every fragment of wealth carefully locked away over decades, passed into their hands. There was no mention of her name. Not even a token acknowledgement beyond the vague assurance that she would be looked after. The word struck her like blows. She had prepared herself for disappointment, yet the finality of it hollowed her chest. The promises whispered in moments of intimacy, the assurances she had carried in her heart for years, had been erased with a few strokes of ink. She sat in silence as her brothers' faces lit with triumph, their hands already gripping the future that had been handed to them. Her own face remained composed, her grief buried beneath layers of dignity. She did not weep, though her heart cracked beneath the weight of betrayal. The sons wasted no time cloaking their greed in celebration. Even before the mourning period ended, feasts were held in the great hall, tables laden with meats, wines, and fruits as though death itself had come bearing gifts. They laughed loudly, boasting of the lands they would claim, the fortunes they would multiply. Servants were ordered to polish the gold and jewels so they might gleam brighter for the eyes of guests invited to share in their triumph. The daughter moved like a shadow among them, unseen, unacknowledged. She watched as they raised their cups, as they toasted their father not with reverence but with smug delight. The same halls that once echoed with her father's stern voice now rang with arrogance and careless laughter. No one noticed the silent figure at the edge of the room, no one heard the quiet breaking of a heart that had once believed itself cherished. And so the will was sealed, not only on paper but in her fate. She had been cast aside, a ghost in her own home, left with nothing but memories of a promise that had never been honored. Yet even as the feasts raged and the sons celebrated, something darker stirred beneath the surface, waiting for its moment to rise. For the gold they clutched so proudly would not remain theirs for long. Already, unseen, the shadows in the vault began to breathe. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, as though the estate itself were exhaling after years of suffocation. At first, the servants noticed the change. A coin dropped upon the floor no longer rang with that sharp metallic note but landed with a dull, heavy thud. The gleam that once blinded the eyes seemed dimmer, as if some invisible hand had brushed a film of shadow across the gold. No one dared to speak of it openly for fear of angering the new masters, but whispers threaded through the corridors. The wealth was sickening. Soon the change could no longer be denied. A chest of coins, open to impress a visiting merchant, revealed not the dazzling shimmer of fortune but tarnished discs, their surfaces blotched with black as though they had been scorched by fire. Necklaces snapped in half when lifted, their chains brittle like the bones of the long dead. Rings cracked under the pressure of a finger, gemstones crumbling to dust as though their brilliance had been nothing more than fragile glass. The vaults, once a place of pride, began to stink of decay, an acrid odor that clung to the walls and seeped through the mansion above. The sons grew restless. They accused the servants of mishandling the treasures, of theft, of incompetence. Whips were raised, punishments dealt, but still the gold rotted in their hands. The eldest, proud and domineering, insisted it was sabotage. The middle son, quick-tempered and suspicious, swore it was the youngest, eager to hoard the inheritance for himself. The youngest, sly and ambitious, blamed them both and whispered of conspiracies in the dark. Quarrels turned to shouts, shouts to blows, until the estate that once hummed with revelry trembled with violence. But the servants whispered another tale. At night, when they passed the hallways, they heard voices where no one stood, low murmurs that rose from the walls themselves, words too garbled to understand but heavy with malice. Shadows moved without light to summon them, slipping across floors and ceilings like stains of ink. In the stillness of midnight, doors groaned open of their own accord, and footsteps echoed in empty corridors. Some swore they saw the father's figure, pacing the halls as he had in life, but his eyes glowed with a hunger far darker than ambition. Others claimed the gold itself whispered, the clinking of coins forming words that promised ruin to those who dared to claim them. The daughter, cast aside, watched these things unfold with a stillness that unsettled even the bravest of servants. She had not raised a hand, had not spoken words of sorcery, yet her very presence became suspect. The brothers began to eye her with hostility, whispering that she had cursed the estate, that she had poisoned the wealth out of vengeance for her exclusion. They recalled the nights she had sat by their father's side, listening when no one else would, and twisted the memory into proof. She had learned secrets, invoked spirits, planted ruin at the heart of their fortune. They confronted her, voices dripping with accusation. "What have you done?" they demanded. "What hex did you whisper into our father's ear? What spell have you cast upon our inheritance?" She answered them not with defiance but with calm. "I have done nothing," she said softly. "It is not I who brings this ruin. It is the gold itself. It knows it does not belong to you." Her words unsettled them more than any denial could have, for in their hearts, buried beneath arrogance and greed, they felt the truth. Yet they would not admit it. To do so would mean facing the possibility that the wealth they had worshipped all their lives was rotting by its own will, rejecting them as unworthy heirs. Instead, they clung to suspicion, to rage, to their desperate need for control. The curse deepened. Entire chests of coins dissolved into ash when touched. Goblets used in feasts turned black at the lips, staining the mouths of those who drank from them until they spat blood. Jewels melted into sludge, seeping across the vault floors like festering wounds. The vault doors groaned as though in pain, their iron hinges bleeding rust. And still the brothers refused to let go. They clutched the coins even as they crumbled in their palms, coughing on the dust that filled their lungs. The daughter wandered the estate quietly, her heart torn between grief and grim recognition. She had not summoned this fate, yet it felt as though the world itself had answered her suffering. The promise broken by her father, the injustice cemented by ink, had not gone unnoticed. The wealth, born of greed and guarded by arrogance, had turned against its own keepers. She wondered at times whether her father's restless spirit had called it forth, or whether the gold itself, hoarded too long, had grown weary of being bound. Perhaps curses did not always need witches. Perhaps they were born from the sins that gave them life. The brothers' paranoia grew until it consumed them. They locked the vaults, then unlocked them again in desperate search of salvageable treasures. They barred windows, set guards at doors as though walls of stone could keep out the decay that spread from within. Their laughter, once bold and carefree, turned shrill and cracked. They no longer trusted one another, nor the servants, nor even the walls that seemed to lean closer each day. Through it all, the daughter remained a still figure in the storm. The household whispered that she was untouched because she had called it forth, but the truth was simpler and far more terrible. She did not need to touch the gold. She had already been denied it. The curse had no hold over her because she had never claimed what was never hers. And so the estate descended into madness, not through daggers or armies, but through the silent betrayal of its own riches. The vaults that once gleamed with treasures became tombs of ash. The great halls, once alive with feasts, filled with whispers and shadows. And the brothers, blinded by greed, were left clutching at ruin, their hands stained with the dust of what they had once called their inheritance. What is gold, after all, if it rots in your hand? They cast her out when the whispers grew too loud to ignore. The brothers, trembling in their greed and fear, drove her from the halls of her childhood as though she were the root of the decay. She did not resist. She did not beg. She walked from the estate with her head unbowed, carrying nothing but the clothes upon her back and the memory of promises broken. Behind her, the mansion loomed, its windows dark as hollow eyes, its riches already half ruined. The gates clanged shut, and with that final sound she understood that her place in the family had ended. The road was long and bitter. She had never known hunger as her father had, yet now it stalked her steps. She wandered from village to village, surviving on what kindness she could find, though kindness was scarce for a woman alone. Children sometimes gathered at her side, curious about the quiet figure who walked without complaint, who seemed untouched by despair. She gave them stories instead of coin, tales her father had once told her in softer moments, stories she had reshaped with her own truth. In her words, kings who hoarded treasure crumbled into dust, while those who cherished wisdom endured. It was in these wandering years that she encountered the voices of the world beyond her family's shadow. In a village by the river, an old crone, bent by time but sharp of eye, warned her, "Gold built on blood and betrayal turns to dust, child. It always has. It always will. Better to hold an empty hand than one full of ash." The daughter bowed her head, recognizing in those words the truth she had already begun to live. In another place, a wandering monk shared his fire with her on a cold night. He told her of rulers who had lost empires for the sake of glittering trinkets, of men who had slain their brothers for coins that slipped like sand between their fingers. "The earth rejects greed," he said simply, stirring the embers with a stick. "What cannot feed the spirit will be swallowed by the soil. Remember that." These encounters were like waystones along her path, guiding her away from bitterness and toward understanding. She could have let anger consume her, could have cursed her brothers, could have spent her nights dreaming of vengeance. Yet she chose instead to let go. Each step carried her further from the weight of her family's wealth, further from the hunger that had devoured them. She discovered strength not in what she owned but in what she endured. As months turned to years, the contrast between her and her brothers grew stark. Rumors reached her ears of their descent into madness. The eldest, it was said, locked himself in the vaults, clawing at the ashes of coins, convinced he could still find treasure hidden beneath the decay. The middle son, violent and paranoid, lashed out at everyone around him until even the servants fled, leaving him alone with his fury. The youngest scoured distant markets, trying to sell what little gold had not yet turned to dust, only to watch it crumble in his hands before the eyes of horrified buyers. Their names, once spoken with envy, became curses on the tongues of villagers. She meanwhile lived with humility. She learned to sew her own garments, to mend her shoes, to trade stories and knowledge for bread. She discovered that dignity was not tied to jewels, that strength was not measured in coins. In her solitude, she came to know herself not as a cast-off daughter, but as a woman forged in fire, fire that did not consume her but purified her. In the evenings, she would sometimes sit by streams or under the canopy of trees, listening to the voices of the earth. The rustling of leaves, the murmuring of water, the crackle of flames, all seemed to whisper the same lesson: let go. The wealth that had been denied her had never truly belonged to her. It had been a burden disguised as a gift, a poison clothed in beauty. By being denied it, she had been spared the fate of her brothers. Her heart grew lighter with each passing season. Where once she had carried the ache of betrayal, now she carried the quiet pride of survival. She began to write her own stories, inscribing them on scraps of parchment, tales that carried warnings wrapped in parables. In these stories, daughters were not silent shadows but the keepers of truth, and gold was always revealed for what it truly was: fleeting, fragile, and false. When travelers asked of her past, she would smile faintly and say, "I came from a house where gold was worshipped. But the house fell and the gold turned to dust. I was spared because I carried nothing." Some pitied her, some admired her, but all remembered her words. And so her story spread, not as a tale of misfortune but as a lesson. The further she walked from the ruins of her family, the stronger she became. Though her brothers clung to ashes, she embraced freedom. Though they screamed in madness, she spoke with clarity. She had been denied her inheritance, but in truth she had inherited something far greater: the wisdom that wealth without justice is a curse, and that dignity endures when riches perish. Her journey did not end in riches, nor in vengeance, nor in despair. It ended in a quiet strength, a resilience that no vault could contain. For while her brothers withered in the grip of greed, she grew into something their gold could never buy: a woman unbroken, unbound, and free. The eldest son was the first to feel the collapse of his world. He had always carried himself with the pride of a king in waiting, convinced that the estate and its riches were not only his inheritance but his destiny. When the curse began to show itself in the blackened coins and brittle jewels, he refused to believe it. Night after night, he locked himself within the vaults, torchlight flickering against his strained face as he sifted through the heaps of treasure. He clawed at piles of coins with frantic hands, tossing aside ash and fragments, desperate to find even a handful of gold untouched by the rot. Servants who dared to check on him found him muttering to himself, his once commanding voice reduced to a rasping whisper. Soon, word spread among creditors and noble families who had once courted his favor. They had lent money in expectation of repayment in solid gold, but when the time came he could produce only dust. Their laughter turned to scorn, their envy to ridicule. Invitations ceased, contracts dissolved, and the eldest son found himself shunned. Where once he had ridden proudly through the town, head high and cloak trailing behind, now he slunk through side streets, pelted by the jeers of those who had once bowed before him. The man who had expected to inherit the respect of his father's empire now inherited only disgrace. The middle son fared no better, though his downfall was louder, more violent. He had always been quick-tempered, but paranoia twisted his nature into something monstrous. Convinced that his brothers plotted against him, he began to bar the doors of his wing of the estate, keeping knives hidden beneath his robes, demanding loyalty oaths from servants who already feared him. He raged through the halls at night, accusing shadows of theft, slashing at curtains as though they concealed spies. When a chest of jewels crumbled to nothing before his eyes, he flew into a frenzy, smashing furniture and striking any servant unfortunate enough to cross his path. One evening, his suspicion turned to his eldest brother. Convinced that he had hidden intact treasures away, the middle son stormed into the vaults with fire in his eyes, demanding proof. What followed was chaos: shouts, blows, torches overturned in struggle. The servants fled, too terrified to intervene. By dawn, the middle son staggered out, his hands bloodied, his eyes wild, claiming victory though he carried nothing. The eldest vanished from sight soon after, and rumors spread that his body lay buried beneath the vault stones, another victim of the gold's decay. The youngest son, sly and ambitious, had watched his brother's descent with cold calculation. He believed himself clever enough to escape their fate. Where they had clung to the estate, he sought to turn its cursed treasures into coin elsewhere. He traveled to distant towns, carrying chests of gold and jewels, presenting himself as the last reliable heir of a once mighty family. At first, merchants welcomed him, dazzled by the gleam of what appeared to be fortune. But when they attempted to weigh the coins, they found only blackened lumps. When they tried to cut the jewels, they shattered like brittle stone. In one marketplace, before the eyes of a gathered crowd, he held up a ruby the size of a dove's egg, only to watch it crumble into red dust between his fingers. Laughter followed him out of the square, laughter that clung to his every step thereafter. Desperate, he returned to the estate, only to find it hollowed by ruin. The halls, once filled with music and feasts, echoed now with the shrieks of the middle brother's madness and the silence of the eldest's absence. The servants had fled, creditors circled like vultures, and the land itself seemed cursed, fields unplowed, orchards barren, wells soured. The estate, once a monument to triumph, had become a skeleton gnawed by unseen teeth. It was then that the collapse came in full. A fire broke out in the eastern wing, whether from carelessness or from some darker cause, no one could say. The flames spread quickly, fed by the dry timbers of a house already weakened by neglect. Some swore they saw shapes in the smoke, faces twisted with greed, reaching hands consumed by fire. Others whispered that the estate had kindled itself, tired of housing a legacy of betrayal. By dawn, the mansion was a blackened husk, its towers collapsed, its vaults cracked open to reveal nothing but ash. The brothers' names were ruined. Where once they had been envied, now they were pitted, mocked, or cursed. The eldest, if alive, wandered as a beggar stripped of his pride. The middle son, consumed by his paranoia, vanished into the wilderness, leaving behind only stories of a madman raving at shadows. The youngest clung longest to hope, but every town turned him away, every coin disintegrated, until he too faded into obscurity. The estate itself became a warning, its ruins looming over the valley like a grave marker. Travelers pointed to it and told their children, "That is what comes of greed. That is what happens when men worship gold." For in the end it was not war, nor famine, nor strangers that destroyed the family but their own hunger. The gold they had worshipped betrayed them, their inheritance devoured them, and their legacy turned to nothing but dust and ashes. Justice had been served, not by court or sword, but by the weight of their own sins. They had feasted while their sister was cast aside, they had clutched their inheritance with clawing hands, and they had been consumed by it. Their father's vow to conquer poverty had ended not in triumph but in ruin, for greed is a fire that burns most fiercely in the hands that grasp it. Thus the family fell, not with honor, not with remembrance, but with whispers of warning carried on the wind. And in the shadow of their ruin, only one remained untouched, the daughter who had been denied but in denial had been freed. The estate was silent when she returned. What once stood as a monument to her father's triumphs lay in ruin, scorched beams jutting like broken ribs against the sky, the once grand windows shattered, the gardens overgrown with weeds. Ash clung to the stones, and the air still carried a faint charred scent, as though the fire that had devoured it all had left its spirit smoldering. She stood at the gates where she had once been cast out, no longer a girl but a woman tempered by years of endurance. The gates hung loose, rust eating their hinges, and with a gentle push they opened, not to resist her but to yield. Her steps crunched over brittle remains as she entered. The halls that had echoed with laughter and music now murmured only with the wind. She passed the vaults, their doors gaping like mouths, their insides black and empty. She remembered the greed that had burned brightest here, the brothers' fevered eyes when the curse had begun its work. Now there was nothing to see but soot and dust. Her brothers were gone. One lost to disgrace, another to madness, the last to futile schemes. Their names lingered only as whispers of warning in nearby villages. She carried no treasure with her. There was no need. She had long since learned that wealth did not lie in coins that crumble or jewels that betray their owners. Her inheritance was something else entirely, something invisible yet unbreakable. The dignity to endure, the freedom to live unshackled by gold, and the memory of her father in the rare moments when he had seen her, truly seen her, as more than a daughter to be dismissed. Standing in the ruined great hall, she traced the outlines of her childhood. She remembered the way sunlight once spilled across polished floors, the way her father's voice carried during feasts, the way she had stood in the corners unnoticed, until he would sometimes turn, just briefly, and let his eyes rest on her with a glimmer of pride. Those memories were more precious to her than any vault of riches, for they were hers alone, untouchable by curse or fire. She knelt among the ashes and gathered a handful in her palm. It sifted through her fingers like sand, soft and weightless, a mockery of the mountains of gold her brothers had once fought over. This was all that remained of their legacy, all their wealth distilled into powder too insubstantial to cling to the hand. She let it fall and the wind carried it away. In that moment she understood the final lesson. Inheritance was never about the gold her father left behind, nor the vaults he had so obsessively guarded. True inheritance was carried in the heart, the love she remembered, the strength she had cultivated, the dignity she had preserved when all else was stripped from her. Her brothers had inherited the gold, and it had consumed them. She had inherited the burden of denial, and from it she had forged her freedom. She rose and turned her back on the estate. There was nothing here for her anymore, no ghost she needed to chase, no riches to reclaim. The ruins could collapse into the earth, the dust scatter to the winds, it mattered little. What mattered was the life ahead of her, a life unchained from greed, unbound from curses, untouched by the rod of gold. She walked away with light steps, her soul unburdened, her heart unbroken. The valley swallowed the estate behind her, and the world opened before her with the promise of roads unwritten. She carried with her no jewel, no coin, no heirloom, yet she felt richer than she had ever been. For in truth she had claimed the only inheritance that mattered, the strength to endure, the wisdom to see beyond illusions, the freedom to live unshackled. And so the tale closed as it had begun, with the question that had haunted her father's house. What is gold worth if it rots in your hand? She had lived the answer, and now she knew. In the end their gold was dust. But she carried something they could never claim: freedom.